Hello and welcome to another Intro to Java CS0 video. In this video, we are going to add on to the basic GUI template that we made in the last video. We're going to look at a new file called Hello World. We're going to look at things like comments and JTextField and JLabel. We're going to figure out how to create a JTextField and label, how to add them to the JFrame, and then how to run it with those things in there. We're going to look at some of the subtle nuances that you need to pay attention to when creating GUI components and adding them to your JFrame. Let's get started. I'd like to start by talking about comments. Comments are pieces of code that you put in your programs that are used to inform other people and yourself actually about what you were thinking and what you were doing when you wrote the code. Now, there are lots of different philosophies on how you should comment and what should be commented and what shouldn't be commented. Some people believe in minimal amount of commenting, that your code should be written in such a way that it is very clear and easy to read and reads like a book and doesn't necessitate comments. Some people believe that you should put in very robust comments that do things like preconditions and postconditions and have a clear explanation of the purpose of everything that's in there, and some people are kind of in the middle. I'm going to teach you sort of a middle approach. Most of the comments that I'm going to create in my examples are going to be very descriptive and instructional. You would never make comments like that professionally, because the people that are going to read it already know what these things are. You're going to more make comments that will inform people of the reasons why you made certain types of decisions, and that are going to inform them on what the algorithms that you wrote are doing and how to implement them into other things. All right, let's take a look at some comments. This right here is a header comment, and this is going to be on pretty much every project that you make, and they can look different depending on the organization, but some things that you should have in there is information about who wrote it, so author Charlie Gorel, the organization that you're working for, the company that you're working for. In this case, it's NHCC CS0. It's a CS0 course at North Hennepin. You should talk about what the project is, and this is Unit 1 videos, and then, have the date in there. And you might have some other things like the version and all kinds of other stuff that you think is important to tell people about what this project is about. You should do this on all of your assignments in this class, just so that when I open your projects, I can clearly see whose work it is. Let's take a look at some other types of comments. Right here is a block comment. A block comment can stretch across many lines. It starts with a slash and a star and ends with a star and a slash. And then you put your comment in between it. Comments are ignored by the compiler. They're not actual code. They're there for us, the developer. So let's say you make a really complex program and you spent weeks crunching out this code. You had to really think hard to plan out your algorithms, solve the problems, and then implement the code. And then you put it away for a month, and you come back to look at it, and you don't remember what you did and why you did the things that you did. And you struggle to read the code. That could be a problem when you're updating your own code. Another example, there's this company called Blizzard, which makes video games, and they had a big project going at one point, and things weren't going well in the project, and they fired all their developers. Some of them quit, a lot of them got fired. Well, they went on to hire a whole new team of developers, and those developers came back and looked at the software the previous team had built and found it totally uncommented. They didn't know how to make heads or tails of the code. They had to scrap the entire project the previous team had been working on and start from scratch. Blizzard probably lost millions of dollars because of that. Commenting is important. It's going to be used by other developers, it's going to be used by you later on. You got to remember that software has a lifespan that extends far beyond the day that you publish it. That software is going to be extended at some point. It's going to be updated. It's going to be worked on and supported by other developers and by you and your team. You've got to be able to read that software and know how to interact with it. So good commenting is important. All right, anyways, this is a block comment. Usually use those for longer explanations for what parts of code do. And in these examples that I give you and that you can get from the class website, they're going to be very detailed comments. I'm not going to read those comments to you here. Presumably you have these examples open on your screen right now. This is an example of a line end comment, and it is just on one line. These are usually for shorter descriptions of things. It's a really brief statement. You can put them at the end of a statement or up above blocks of statements. So they get ignored by the compiler, and we just use them to inform us and inform other developers about what's going on in the code. So that's a little bit about comments. Let's take a look at this project. We can take a look at and find the similarities with basic GUI templates. So this is the basic GUI template that you saw in the previous video. You should be familiar with it by now, so I'm not going to explain it in depth, but we've got our header, extends JFrame. We instantiate our basic GUI template in the main. We set the size on that object. We create our GUI, which is this method right here that sets a default close operation, and it creates our window content pane. After that, we set visible to true. You're going to find that's going to be common on the Hello World. You'll find all those same things. We've got our Hello World instantiation here. We set the size. I set it to 300 by 300. I set up my GUI, which is my method, and Java is going to search for that method. It's going to find it here. And then we've got set visible true. So here's our setup GUI method, and you're going to find everything that sets up the GUI in there. All right, now let's look at what this does. I'm going to run this program. And it brings up this JFrame with a very simple GUI, or graphical user interface. It's got a JLabel that says Hello World. It's got a JTextField that says input text here. I can replace that text with anything that I want. Very simple GUI. Let's talk about, in general, how GUI components are created and added to a frame. First off, GUI components are objects. They're objects from classes like JLabel, JTextField, JTextArea, JSlider. All these things are different classes that are in the Swing library. So let's take a look at how we use those. I've created two variables here. Now you'll see that these variables are in between the class header and the main. I can declare variables out in this area, okay? But that's about the only thing I can do then in that area. Everything else that you program always has to be in between the braces of the main or in between the braces of other methods. These things are variables. So what's a variable? Variable is like a box that can store stuff. Java is a strictly typed language, and what that means is that when you create one of these boxes, when you create one of these variables, you have to create it with a type declared. So if I wanted to make an integer, I have to make my integer here called num to a type. Other languages, if you have done something like JavaScript, which is loosely typed, all variables are just named like this. And you can put any type of data into that variable. Java doesn't work like that. Java says that when you create a variable, you have to give it a type, and you can only put things of that type in the variable. So this one can only take ints, okay? It can't take floating point numbers. It can't take char literals. Well, actually it can take char literals. We'll get to that in another video because char literals are actually kind of like numbers. It cannot take string literals. It can only take things that are int-like. So we can put an int in there, put a char in there, but Java is strictly typed. So all variables have to be declared to a type. You can only put that thing in there. So I've created these variables here at class level. We call these instance variables, and in future videos we'll explain why this is important. Just know that we do this so that we can use those variables in many places in the code. All right, so I set up these variables because I'm going to create a JLabel and a JTextField later on in the code here, and store them into those variables. Let's talk about the lifespan of a variable. Variables have 3 stages in life, roughly. They've got declaration, they've got initialization, and they've got reassignment. Okay? Declaration is this step right here. Declaration says that we are creating a new variable. We're declaring that a new variable is going to exist of a certain type. When we do declaration, Java is going to set aside a location in your computer's physical memory where that data can be stored. So it's kind of like we're creating a box inside the computer that we can put stuff in. So this is declaration. Right? The next step, initialization. Let's find where these are initialized. We're going to scroll down past the main. We're going to scroll down into setup GUI. And then we're going to scroll down past these comments, and we're going to find these lines right here, lines 50 and 51. This right here is initialization of those variables. Initialization means we are giving the variables their first value. In other words, we're assigning something into it for the first time. Variable assignment looks like this. On the left side, we're going to find the variable name. We'll find the assignment operator, and on the right side, we're going to find the assignment statement. This is the assignment operator. This doesn't have to do with equals. So you've been doing math since you were, what, 2, 3 years old. And when you were about 4 or 5, you started doing arithmetic operations like summing and subtraction and stuff like that. And what you do is you put a arithmetic statement on one side of that operator, and on the other side you have another arithmetic statement that balances out, and on either side of that they should be equal. And that's why we call that the equals operator in math. Well, this is not math, this is programming. And this operator in Java is called the assignment operator. You can only put one thing on the left of the assignment operator, and that's a variable. The right side of the assignment operator is going to have some sort of programming statement that is going to resolve to some type that can be fit into the variable. So in this case, we're creating a new JLabel that says hello world on it, and we're assigning it into greeting. Later on, we're going to look at statements that compare one thing to another, and that will involve using the equivalence operator. This one checks to see if 2 things are equal. This one does not. So don't even call that thing equals. You're going to notice that in my videos and in my instruction, I always say something like, greeting is assigned the value new JLabel, or I'm going to say greeting gets a new JLabel. Most of the time I'm just going to say greeting gets this thing, because this is not equals. If you hear yourself saying greeting equals new JLabel, stop it right now. I believe that language is very important, and language establishes a reality in your mind. I'm not going to get too deep into the philosophy behind this, but when you get in the habit of saying things and thinking things in these words, it reshapes the way you perceive the world around you. So if you start looking at this thing as the equals operator, you're going to make some serious mistakes later on. Things like if n1 equals 6. Well, if you're thinking that this is equals, you might make this mistake, and you're going to have a very serious error here. That's not the way it would work. If you wanted to check equivalence, you'd go n1 equals 6. When I would say this statement here, n1 6, I would say n1 is assigned the value 6, or I would say n1 gets 6. So get in the habit of not saying equals for that thing. We're not in arithmetic anymore. We're in programming. All right, so this is an assignment statement, and it's the first time that this has been assigned, so we call it initialization. So I'm going to initialize my greeting label and my input field. So every time we make one of these GUI components, these JLabel or these J components, they're objects. So I was going to start with the new operator and then this thing called a constructor. Different J components are going to take different things into these parameters. Once again, the parameter is everything that's in between those parentheses. JLabel just takes in a string literal. And when we take in that string literal, I'll run this. That string literal will show up on that label. If I change this, hello NHCC, and I run it, you'll see that is what will display on that label. Okay? So that's what a JLabel is. It's just a box that holds a message that you can put into a GUI. JTextField takes in a string literal and an int. Parameters in methods and in constructors can have many arguments. And those arguments are always separated by commas. So a parameter we would call a parameter list. And it's a comma-separated list of all the things that are going to set up the initial state of that object. JTextField requires you to put in a string literal and an int that's going to define how many spaces that JTextField will have. So this JTextField defaults to 25 wide. If I set this to 10, you're going to, if I set this to 10, you're going to notice that the text field is going to be narrower. See, it's a little bit narrower. You're also going to notice that this string here is what shows up as the default text in the field. All right, so this is instantiation of our GUI components. All right, so we've done declaration and we've done initialization. Reassignment is the idea that you can reuse those variables over and over and over and over and over again. We're going to get to reassignment in a future video. Okay? Now, I've declared these variables up here at class level, so they're instance variables. That means that I could use them if I wanted to here in the main. I can use them here in setup GUI. I could make other methods and use them. All I'm doing with this is I am creating those components here. Let's take a look again at the create GUI or the setup GUI method. We've got our set default close operation, which we've seen before. We've got our content pane being assigned into this container called window. Here I'm doing something called set layout, and I'm assigning it a flow layout. Let's see what that does. Flow layout allows us to have multiple components in a frame, and what they're going to do is they're going to line up side by side on a line. If that line doesn't have enough room, it's going to bump one component down to the next line. That's what a flow layout. It allows the components to just kind of flow. Later on in future units and future videos, we're going to look at more layout managers that allow us to control how GUI components are arranged within the frame. For now, we're just going to look at flow layout because it's the simplest. We don't even have to think about it. So that's what set layout does. It looks at that content pane object in the window and makes sure that everything in that content pane is going to flow. All right, so here's our creation of our GUI components, and the last thing we have to do is add them. If I don't add those components to the window, they get created, they're there in memory, but they're not actually in the frame. I'm going to comment this out for just a second, and then I'm going to run it. You'll see the frame pop up, but the components won't be there. See? Well, I've created those components, so they exist, but they just don't exist in the content pane yet. See? I'm going to bring them back and run it. And you can see that our components are back in the frame. All right. That's how to create and add GUI components to the content pane of JFrame. Now let's review these steps. GUI components are going to have the following steps. First step is going to be declaration of variables. Because all GUI components are objects, objects have to be stored in variables. Next, instantiation or initialization of the objects. And we saw that right down here. This is the initialization or initialization of the variables or instantiation of the objects. Next, add components to the content pane. There are going to be some other steps in future videos. When we want to make components interactive, we're going to have to do something with something called an action listener. And then what we'll do with the components is we will create the action listener, we'll create the action performed method, and then we'll have to register those components to the listener. But we'll get to those steps in a future video. For now, just so you know, these are the first 3 steps any GUI component is going to need. And we always have to do those steps. Now, let's talk about one more thing that's really important. And here's an error that students often make. They'll define a method, but then they'll forget to call the method. Let's say I forget to call this setup GUI method. What a method is it's the potential for code to be executed. But this method declaration or method definition here isn't actually the execution of any code. This is setting up the conditions for some code that can be executed or can happen. So if I run this, it's going to create my JFrame, it's going to set the size of it, it's going to set it to visible, but it won't set up the GUI. Watch, I'll run it, you'll see none of the GUI elements will show up. See that? None of my GUI components are there. Because I did not call on this method. This code does not get executed until the method is invoked. Remember, when we get to this line right here, it finds the dot operator, it finds this method signature, it's going to look in the class for this signature, and when it finds it, it executes everything inside. It does not execute anything inside that method until it gets this invocation. All right? Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take 10 or 15 minutes and I want you to analyze this code, look at all the pieces that are going to create the variables for the GUI components, instantiate the GUI components, and add them to the JFrame. Pause the video and do that. I'm going to come back and I'm going to have a fully completed basic GUI template with these components in it. So you do your work, I'll do mine, and we'll be back in just a few seconds. Welcome back. I assume that you did your part of the work. You went to Hello World, analyzed the code, reviewed all the stuff we talked about, found all the parts that you needed to create your components and add them to your basic GUI template, and then you implemented that code. Part of active learning is actually writing the code. You can't just read this stuff, you can't just watch these videos and expect this stuff to solidify in your brain. You need to write code to learn to code. In fact, you need to write a lot of code to get good at writing code. So make sure that anytime you read code or watch videos with code, you are typing that stuff out with the videos. If that means that you have to pause things because the person making the video is going too fast for you, pause those things and write out that code. Don't do passive learning. Engage in the process, write the code, and build those skills that you need to be a good developer. All right. So I've got my basic GUI template. We saw all the stuff in the previous video. Here I'm declaring my variables, making them instance variables so I can access them in every method. Here I'm creating my components. These are my 2 instantiation statements. We saw those both in Hello World. And here I'm adding the components to the content pane. The other thing that wasn't in the previous version of basic GUI template was setting the layout. So you have to make sure you do that as well. You do all these things and you're going to have a JFrame that looks just like mine. Hey, good work, we did it. Now, if you really want to give yourself a little bit of a challenge, why don't you do this? Do a Google search for Java API Swing, and you're going to find docs.oracle.com Swing. In here, you're going to find a whole bunch of stuff, and you're going to find all these things that have J's in it. Why don't you look for things that you might be able to implement? Maybe a J button, a J checkbox, maybe a J combo box, maybe any of these things. See if you can figure out how to implement them into your basic GUI template. I'm going to challenge you before the next video to look at the API here for J button and see if you can read it. Read through this section up here that tells you where these things come from, so you know the history of JButton. Read through this section here that's going to give a description of what it does. Read through these things here, which are going to tell you some things about that class, and then right here about the fields that you have available to you, and right here the constructors. See if you can kind of figure out what they do. I'm not going to explain them right now. We'll get into APIs at another point, but it's a good idea to start getting an introduction to what this is and see if you can kind of figure it out. You might find that this right here looks a lot like something in our code. This right here on a JLabel, right? So when we look at the constructor summary here, see if you can figure out how to construct a JButton. See if you can look at some of these methods right here and see if you can figure out what someone might do. All right? Anyhow, that's all I've got for you in this video. In the next video, we're actually going to talk about making a JButton and making it interactive. Thanks for watching.